That's the Sex Offenders Amendment Bill 2018, second stage. And I call on Deputy Maureen O'Sullivan to move the second reading motion. Deputy, to move.
I'd move.
That the Deputy has moved that the bill be now read a second time. Deputy, you have 20 minutes.
Thank you. And I think, first of all, apologies are owed to the staff for the lateness of the hour at which this business is being taken. Okay, so first of all, I want to thank my colleagues in the Independents for Change for having this space here this evening to try and progress this bill further. This is a bill about children. It's about protecting children, particularly from those who, for various reasons, sexually abuse children. Ireland has a horrific past when it comes to protecting and guarding children, and we saw it in the industrial schools, in the mother and baby homes, in the laundries, and in some of the foster homes. But Ireland has come a long way in trying to ensure the safety of children. And we are working in relation to child welfare and child protection. We have Children First Act, child protection procedures for primary and post-primary schools, and there's child safeguarding statements. We have designated liaison officers in schools and guard the vetting of those who are working with children. And while there are still gaps and there's still room for improvement, imagine what it must be like for children in those countries where there is no protection for them, where there's no child welfare and no safeguards. And that's what this bill is about. It's trying to protect children who are easy prey to sexual predators, children in countries where the authorities can't protect them or the authorities won't protect them. Now, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child recognises a child as someone who is under the age of 18 years. Trafficking is the third biggest billion-dollar industry after arms and drugs. Conservative estimates put the number of children trafficked at 4.5 million, and within that statistic there is another to suggest that 2 million children are lured or abducted into sexual exploitation, which is a modern-day slavery. It's incredulous actually that we're talking about a child sex industry, a child sex tourism, because it's like they're contradictions in terms, but the consequences for those children are horrific. They're physical, they're mental, they're emotional, they're psychological. There is suicide, there's depression, there's addiction, there are sexually transmitted illnesses including HIV and AIDS. We're talking about countries in Southeast Asia and India, in Latin America, South America, the Caribbean, in Africa, and the common denominator is poverty and the lack of education. So child sexual abuse, it's about manipulating and it's about exploiting vulnerabilities. We have many high-profile cases, but I'll just mention one, which is of a 7-year-old child who was sold to a former American Marine. He was eventually extradited from the country in Southeast Asia and is serving very, very extended prison sentence in the United States. We have records of the sale of virgin girls and also of organised sex rings. And when you look at the work of ECPAT International, a report of theirs, they talk about child sex tourism having increased drastically, and one of the reasons is the increase in global travel, which has created more opportunities for abuse. The profile of the offender has also changed. The stereotype was of the white, Western, wealthy, middle-aged man, some women, and while that continues, there's also what's now called the situational offender, those who would not have sought to sexually exploit a child but will have given the opportunity to do so. So we're talking about business travellers and migrant transient workers. And allied with that, of course, is the promotion of these poorer countries for economic growth, and that is driving tourism in their countries and bringing more and more Westerners into the countries where there is little or no regulation or policing, but where there are more and more children who are available for sex. I came across an account of an organisation who are offering sex tours with stops at bars and restaurants that were fronts for child prostitution. And for these sex tourists, they described it that it was like going to McDonald's. There was a menu to choose from, it was quick and it was cheap. I want to refer to the work of Irish priest Father Shay Cullen in the Philippines, who's been working directly in rescuing and supporting children in the sex tourism industry. And at a recent press conference, he spoke of what's been happening through the dark web and the rise in child pornography. To join a photo-sharing paedophile club on the dark web, new applicants have to submit pictures of children being abused. Some clubs insist on the applicant showing himself doing the abuse. And to get these images, those men will travel abroad to the countries where there are ample opportunities to photograph and video. Those images then give them a pass to access further unlimited images. And this need to provide pictures is fueling the travel to poorer countries. Cybersex is on the increase. Shay spoke about 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds being abused over the internet. This abuse is being done to order, and there's customers in countries around the world who are paying per view through money transfer companies. In Australia in 2017, it emerged that annually some 700 to 800 Australian men, convicted child sex offenders, they travel annually to countries in Southeast Asia like the Philippines and Cambodia and Thailand. Then the Australian government acted. With their Passports legislation amendment, Overseas Travel by Child Sex Offenders Act in 2017. It was introduced in their Parliament on the 14th of June 2017. It passed both houses on the 20th of June, and it received assent on the 26th of June, all in the same year. That Act allows a competent government authority to request the Minister for Foreign Affairs to refuse to issue or to cancel or to order the surrender of a person's Australian passport if that person's name is on a child protection offender register. And it is to prevent reportable offenders from travelling overseas to sexually exploit or sexually abuse vulnerable children where those activities are not monitored. And so to this bill now tonight. I want to thank Maeve in the Library and Research, David in the Parliamentary Legal Advisor and Kieran in my office for their work. I know it's a tricky one because of the constitutional right to travel, and I think it's good. First of all, that it's a good example of that aspect of unintended consequences. Because while it's wonderful to have the right to travel, surely not a right to travel to abuse children in other countries when you have been committed of child sexual abuse in your own country. Now, if we look at some of the commercial jargon on demand, market and supply, we have no ability to target the supply side in other countries, but we agree we could do more in relation to demand. But what we can do is we can protect children by preventing access to the markets by abusers. Child sex tourism is linked with trafficking and with organised crime in many countries, and it's in countries which carry low detection rates and low conviction rates, both here and internationally. So these child abusers, they know that they're carrying a low risk when they engage with child sexual trade abroad. So hence there's a greater need for Irish authorities to do more to prevent access to vulnerable children. So, to quote the bill, it's to regulate and restrict, where appropriate, sex offenders from travelling abroad in the interests of the common good and to protect persons from serious harm outside the state. And it seeks to do that by increasing the powers of judges. So it's not an outright ban on travelling. But currently, there are a number of ways where convicted sex offenders can be prevented from travelling. But an important feature of this bill is the way in which it redefines protection from serious harm to mean physical or psychological harm caused by the person committing a sexual offence, because the current definition of serious harm is very restrictive, so this bill is making it stronger. In relation to the impact on the right to travel, at an international law level at least, restrictions to human rights are permitted as long as they adhere to the standards of legality, necessity and proportionality. So if the bill is passed, the legality element will be fulfilled. The emphasis on the judge's discretion will go to the necessity aspect, and proportionality is covered as the restriction will be on a case-by-case basis. And if at next stage certain countries can be highlighted, those which lack adequate child protection, rather than an outright ban on the travel, that will also cover proportionality. ECPAT have done a lot of work on balancing the right to privacy of a convicted child sex offender with the need to protect children. And one of the recommendations in a particular report is as follows, and it says that every restrictive measure for convicted travelling sex offenders should be adopted on a case-by-case basis with the assessment of a multidisciplinary team, judicial, psychological and the police. And that would also be in keeping with the legislation in some 40 countries where their citizens can be prosecuted for child sexual abuse committed while those citizens are abroad. But we know the difficulty is that in those countries where the child sexual abuse is taking place, it's happening with impunity because the authorities, including the police, are involved. And even though in May 2016, 173 countries signed the optional protocol on the sale of children, child prostitution and child pornography, there is continued widespread child sex tourism with well-known child sex tourism destinations. And at this point, convicted offenders can travel from Europe to those countries to abuse children. There is a need to put child protection at the core of tourism strategies, and there is work and training going on, including in Ireland, for those working in hotels on what to recognise in relation to child sexual abuse and how to identify potential sex tourists. And the organisation doing that in Ireland is MECPAT's Mercy Efforts for Child Protection Against Trafficking in the Hospitality Sector. Some organisations are working on a corporate policy for employers to state that they won't knowingly engage in the sexual exploitation of a child. I know there's varying theories on working with paedophiles and child sex offenders, but I do want to mention the programmes in Ireland for child sex offenders. And speaking with somebody who works in those programmes, he spoke of that moment of insight into the behaviour, into an awareness of what they were doing and the damage, and then the genuine motivation to seek amends and to work on the behaviour. And that's really valuable work. And in the same way that somebody who's in recovery from alcoholism will be advised not to go near a bar or a pub, and somebody recovering from a gambling addiction will be advised not to go near a bookies or somewhere they can bet. Equally, for a child sex offender, I think it will be very helpful for their recovery that they are restricted in being able to travel to countries where children are readily available for sexual abuse. I just want to mention women who are trafficked into this country for the purpose of prostitution, and a common denominator among them is that the prostitution began when they were children, and they owe their lives to organisations like Ruhama. I know the amendment, I read it, and I will address that when I'm concluding the debate. But this is about children. It's about very, very vulnerable children, and it's about giving them the opportunities to develop their potential and not have it cut short by many from our country and from other countries in Europe.
Dr. Maureen O'Sullivan to conclude the debate.
Thank you, Las Kencorla. First of all, sincere thanks to those who took part. I understand the lateness and the continued pushing back of the time, and it made it difficult for some people to stay who did want to speak, so I thank them for the calls to my office in support of this. But a special thank you to those who persevered to speak and to those who stayed in the gallery. With this bill, Ireland would have an opportunity for another first, like the plastic levy ban and the smoking ban. Plastic bag levy, sorry, the lateness of the hour here. But let's look at the realities. And there's a reality behind this bill. And one of those realities is the increase in the number of child sex tourism hotspots with easy access to children. The reality of impunity for abusers in those countries. The reality of the conditions that drive children into the sex industry, some of them sold by their families, but it's conditions of poverty, extreme poverty, unemployment, the lack of access to education, conflict situations. And then there's the reality of the sexual exploit of children. It can be invisible, it's certainly mobile, it's global in both developed and developing world. It's escalating, there's a marked increase in preferences for children, and it's highly profitable. It's facilitated also by easier and cheaper access to travel throughout the world. So this is an opportunity to set a benchmark to protect children from serious harm. It's about protecting children from a person doing outside this state an act which would, if it was committed here, constitute a sexual offence by one who has been released into the community after committing that offence here. The abusers, we know some are paedophiles, some are preferential child sex abusers, situational customers, local prostitute users, tourists, travelling businessmen and some women, migrant foreign workers and the military. And it's reckoned that the issues in the Philippines began with the presence of the US military way back. That led to an increase in the number of bars and brothels and an increase in prostitution. The bill is about empowering judges to impose travel limitations at the time of sentencing or not, if the judge is satisfied that there is or is not a risk of offending abroad. It's proportionate and it's also conditional. For example, leave can be granted to attend a funeral in the UK for a couple of days, but that alarm bells would ring if there was a request to go for 3 weeks to Thailand or to the Philippines. So I just want to stress the narrow remit of the bill. You know, we say that the rights of children are a priority for Ireland. It's certainly outlined in our foreign policy. It's also part of the Irish AIDS document on One World, One Future. Ireland has provided funding for ECPAT, that's the End Child Prostitution and Trafficking International, and in 2016 we gave a grant for 3 years to them for a project in Thailand combating sexual exploitation. So this is a chance with this bill to go even further than that, not just give the money. It's an opportunity to do something significant, something radical, and something that will make a difference in children's lives. So, when I came to the amendment, well, first of all, I was struck by the Minister's optimism that we are going to be here in 12 months' time, so the work will be done within that time frame. So, I thought about it. But I decided to take all the positives from the Minister's speech, and I decided that accepting the amendment is a better way to progress the bill. But yet, we also have to acknowledge the backlog of work for the Justice Committee. So I will accept the Minister's word, and I do hope that we can work on a shorter time frame, or at least a commitment from Fine Gael, if back in government, that this bill won't get lost, but that it will be a priority to be progressed. I think we owe it to those in those countries. And the poverty in those countries, it's related to our developed world, and in particularly to those countries who carved up Southeast Asia, Latin America, South America, Africa for their empires. And it's also related to the continued economic and financial and tax policies of the developed world. So lastly, I am all for working together. I heard the Minister, speak about balancing of rights, but as we're debating this here tonight, there are children and young people, boys and girls, who are being sexually exploited, who are being sexually abused, who are being raped in poor countries by men and some women from our world. And I think it's time to ensure the rights of children to their childhood. And if European countries can prevent football hooligans from travelling to matches, surely we can do more to save children from convicted sex offenders. Because I think the lives of children are more important. Yes, the right to travel, but how can we possibly agree with the right to travel to abuse and hurt and sexually exploit children? And that's what I've been trying to do in this bill, and I do hope that we can see progress on it before the 12 months or before the Dáil finishes. Thank you.
That concludes the debate.